Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So I feel like this video is way overdue, because ever since the RG351V came out, people have been asking, hey, when is 351 Elect going to come out? When's ArkOS coming out? And so on and so forth. And so today we're going to do a guide on all of the different custom firmwares that are currently available for the RG351V. And right now there are 3 available. We're going to focus on ArkOS, 351 Elect, and the Retro Arena. Now, each of these firmwares are still in different stages of being tested, and so they are nowhere close to being the final release at this point. So I just want to preface all of this by saying that a lot of these features are going to change in the coming months. Now that being said, these firmwares already have a good amount of polish to them, and a lot of them have very similar and streamlined features. For example, they all are compatible with Amber ports, which allows you to add standalone ports to your device. And that's really exciting to me. So in this video, we're going to do a quick install of one of these firmwares, and then I'm going to walk you through the features of each of them. And then we'll wrap it all up with a summary of all my findings. So without any further delay, let's just jump into it. So before we start, let me show you my very scientific and official way of testing all this stuff. Basically, I take a sticky note and I write down all the names of the different firmwares, and then I burn different SD cards, and that's just how I do it all. So if you're wondering if I have some sort of like specialized lab that I'm doing all this work in and I'm wearing like goggles and a lab coat, yeah, totally. Okay, let's actually get started now. I'm going to show you how to download this firmware. And I'll have links to all of this stuff in my written guide, which I will have in the video description. So starting with Retro Arena, you want to go to the handheld corner of techtoytinker.com. And here you'll find the RG351V. This developer supports a ton of different firmware, so if you have several devices, I would check out the page and see if there's other firmwares for your devices. So in the RG351V section, you'll find a link to Google Drive, and then within here, just go ahead and download the most recent version of whatever firmware he has available. And this is going to change all the time. He basically has new uploads almost every day at this point. Okay, so that's how you download Retro Arena. Let's move on to ArkOS now. Now we're going to download a test version of ArkOS, which is just a Google Drive link, but once this is all up and running, you're going to find it on the ArkOS wiki page. For now, I'll just have the link in my written guide and I'll update it as it gets updated. And all you have to do for this one is just download it. Okay, moving on to 351 Elect, this one has already been integrated into the actual wiki page. So here all you have to do is navigate to the page that has all of the downloads. You can find it at updates.351elect.org. So after you click on that link, you'll see all the different daily releases. Just choose the most recent release, and then select Arch64, and then pick the 351V. And in this section, you just want to make sure you grab the image file. It's typically the top one here. You can see it says image.gz. And this is the one we're going to install, so I'm just going to download this one here. Okay, so once you've downloaded it, go to the folder where you've downloaded it, and then unzip this file. You could technically flash this GZ file instead of the image file, but people have had issues with that in the past, so I'd just recommend unzipping it. Okay, so once that's done, all we have to do is flash it to an SD card. So I'm going to use a 16GB SD card here. There's multiple apps you can use, for example, Balena Etcher or Win32 Disk Imager. I'm going to use one called Rufus. So in Rufus, make sure you select your SD card. You can see here 16 gigabytes, and then hit the select button and then pick the image you want to flash. Then go ahead and hit the start button, and it'll ask you, hey, do you really want to do this? And you say, yeah, man, I want to do it. It takes about a minute to flash, then go ahead and eject the SD card. Now the 351V has 2 SD card slots, so we're going to use that second SD card to actually store our files. Now we're going to do a little bit of overkill here, but we're actually going to install an SD card formatter from sdcard.org. This is the official formatter for memory cards. So this will be linked in the video description. We basically just go here and install this either for Mac or for Windows. And this SD card formatter defaults to exFAT for any SD card that's over 32 gigs, so it's perfect. So once you've installed it, go ahead and click on it and open it up. And then under select card, just make sure you pick your SD card here. And mine doesn't have a name, that's why it's blank, but you can see it's a 128 gig card. So then you just hit the format button. It's going to ask, do you really want to do this? And you know what to do at this point. Okay, once you're done with that, you're good to go. Eject this SD card as well. Okay, so we're going to put the firmware card, the 16 gigabyte card, in our first SD card slot here. And then we're going to put the 128 gig one that's exFAT partitioned in the second one. After that, all you have to do is just start it up. Now 351 Elect has a really handy feature where it basically detects that second SD card, and then it moves all your game folders over to that second SD card for you. So at that point, after the system has initialized itself and done all of its work in the back end, you can just eject the second SD card and then load it up with all your games and BIOS and everything else like that. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to turn the system off and then put that SD card back into the device. Now at this point, all you have to do is move over your game files into the corresponding folder. And a few weeks ago, I made an RG351V starter guide that talked you through how to move your BIOS folders over in your game folders and how to add media and things like that. All of those tips that are in those guides still apply to these custom firmwares. So if you haven't watched those videos, I would encourage you to watch those just so you can wrap your head around this process. But it's basically very plug and play. You just move your game files into the corresponding folder, and then make sure you move your BIOS files over from your original SD card. Okay, so now that everything's loaded up, this is what 351elec looks like. It has a very nice and clean interface. Now I haven't scraped the media yet for any of these games, that's why you just see the text for these games, but this is what it's going to look like here. And there are all sorts of different themes that you can download. This is basically just EmuElec 2.0, but now on the RG351V. It's pretty awesome. Now when it comes to custom firmwares, I've always said that 351elec is your best entry-level custom firmware, because a lot of the interface has been streamlined for new users. For example, if you go into the Per System Advanced configuration in the Game Settings menu, you can pick out a specific system and then configure all the controls here in the Emulation Station interface. So for example, with Game Boy, you can choose whatever emulator you want to use here. You can change the aspect ratio to whatever you'd like. I would recommend something like 4:3 or Core Provided, which is going to let the emulator choose which one to use. You can turn on a rewind function. It has an autosave and auto-load function. You can set all sorts of different kinds of shaders, which are going to manipulate the screen for you, make them blurrier, add LCD grids. All these kind of things are all available within this setting. You can also turn on integer scaling, which allows you to have perfectly sized pixels. And then for Game Boy, one of the most important is colorization. There are over 100 different colorization options. Personally, I like the DMG one that gives it a kind of green original look to it, but I encourage you to mess around with this and figure out what you like the best. Okay, so let's start up a Game Boy game here. So here's Dr. Mario. You can see it has that green screen now. And because it's integer scaling, it's not taking up that full screen, but it has perfect pixels. Now, if we went back into the settings and turned off integer scaling, this is what it's going to look like. The pixels aren't going to look exactly perfect, but they're still going to look nice and clean on this 4:3 display. And that's one of the powerful things about 351elec, is that you can adjust all those settings in the original main menu like that. You don't have to have a firm understanding of how RetroArch works in order to have the best quality picture and settings for you. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about some of these lower end systems like Game Boy Advance or Nintendo or even Super Nintendo, because at the end of the day, all of these are going to perform well, and they also were just fine on the stock firmware too. So when it comes down to it, these classic consoles are going to play just fine. Where these custom firmwares really shine is when they push performance for some of those higher end systems. So I'm going to spend a lot of this video talking about how those perform. We'll start with PS1. Across the board, PS1 works great. I'm not really going to talk about it anymore in this video. Just know that everything runs at basically 60 frames per second on all three of these custom firmwares. Now, Nintendo DS is a mixed bag. For example, on the 351elec build that we have right now, they haven't yet implemented the ability to move around your stylus. And so because of that, the games are kind of broken. But I expect the team is already probably working on it, and they'll probably change it in the next few weeks. Okay, so moving on to Nintendo 64. On 351elec, this uses a RetroArch core Mupin 64+. You can also use the parallel core. In general, these are set to 640 by 480 resolution, and they have a slight lag, but they still play pretty well. I would say that Nintendo 64 games on this custom firmware run slightly better than the stock firmware. You're going to get lag here and there, and not every game's going to play, but in general, this firmware has customized Nintendo 64 to run optimally using RetroArch cores. Now, moving over to PSP, within 351elec, there are some settings you're going to have to change. I recommend setting everything to 1:1 resolution and then turning on an auto frame skip of 1. What that basically means is that anytime the frame rate dips below 60 but above 30, it's going to do an auto frame skip of 1 frame, which is going to give you smooth gameplay at the expense of having every once in a while a skipped frame. But you can see here with Ridge Racer, even though the frames are going back and forth, you're still getting smooth gameplay because it's staying above 30. Now, something like Outrun 2006, which has a harder time with emulation, you can see it's going below 30, and so because of that, you're getting a lot of slowdown. But there's also a trick for this in the settings. Let me show you how to do that. So you hit the function button to go into settings, and then you want to change the force max FPS down to something like 30. And that basically means it's going to keep the max frame rate at 30 frames per second. So now all of a sudden your frame skip of 1 is going to go down to 15 instead of 30. And as you can see here, the gameplay is a lot smoother. It's a little bit jerky because of all the frame skipping going on, but overall, this is probably the best PSP emulation that you'll find in any of the three custom firmwares. PSP has never been great on these 351 devices, but this is the best performance you're probably going to see. Alright, moving over to Dreamcast here, this also uses RetroArch. You can see here this is the Flycast RetroArch core. And just like with Nintendo 64, this is slightly better than what you would find on stock. And a lot of that has to do with the under-the-hood improvements they've done to the 351 Elect firmware. So even though these games look beautiful with a 640x480 resolution at a perfect 4:3 aspect ratio, the performance is still going to have some noticeable lag. Okay, so we're basically done with 351 Elect at this point. I really wanted to highlight how easy this interface is for newcomers, and how some of that performance looks on those higher end systems. So let's move on to another one here. Let's try the Retro Arena. Now this was the first custom firmware built for the RG351V. And honestly, if it wasn't for a lot of the work that this developer did on this firmware itself, we probably wouldn't have the builds that we have on ArkOS as well as 351 Elect. This developer even got Anbernic to release their source code for the 351V, which allowed the developers to make even more improvements down the line. So that was really awesome. And that's the first time that Anbernic has released their source code for any of the 351 systems. So Retro Arena basically looks like the other firmwares, but it does have some very unique features to it. First and foremost, it has some really beautiful new themes available to it. And one of the things I really like about Retro Arena is that the developer really focuses on making sure there's a wide diversity of platforms and ports available for this firmware. I like to call it the kitchen sink approach, and this is basically like 10 kitchen sinks at this point. There's over 100 different systems that are emulated, and over 100 different ports as well. So if you're interested in getting as many games to play as possible, or there's a certain obscure system you really want to play on this device, Retro Arena is probably going to be your best bet. But it does require a pretty significant level of knowledge on how this stuff works. But luckily the developer, whose name is Slaminger, is very active on Discord, and he can help you out if you have any questions. Now, one noticeable difference between this and 351 Elect is that you actually have to run a script in order to move your game folders over to the second SD card. So if you go into Tools and Scripts, you'll see one here that says Initial Setup for exFAT SD2. So I popped in an exFAT card here, another 128GB card, and then I'm just going to run this script here. And what it's doing is moving all of those ROM folders from your initial SD card, the 16GB one that has the firmware on it, over onto the 128GB card. Now 351 Elect just does this automatically, but with Retro Arena as well as ArkOS, you have to do it manually. And you only have to do this one time, so it's not a big deal, but I wanted to show you how this setup works. Okay, so once you moved your game folders over, you can go and take out the SD card and add all sorts of games and BIOS files and everything else, just like we did with 351 Elect. And here we are with a bunch of games loaded on. And this theme is really awesome. It's by a developer named Cody, and he's been doing such a great job. Between this and another one called Epic Cody, they're really awesome. And the developer here also made some pretty cool intro screens here. As you can see, this is a new one here. And then it boots right into the game from that. And so let's test out Nintendo DS. And the first thing I noticed is that the stylus is working, so that's pretty good. Overall, Nintendo DS gameplay is just fine on this. I would say it's actually a little bit better than it was on the stock firmware, so if you had Nintendo DS games that weren't playing very well on the stock firmware, the custom firmwares are probably going to have better DS gameplay. And when you close out a game, it also has this cool closing video right there. Now, if you go into the settings here in Emulation Station, you're not going to have the wide variety of options that are available in 351 Elect. So the major thing you can change for all the games is to change whatever emulator runs for each system. And that's about the extent of your options within this menu here. And that's because the majority of the changes you're going to make for each of your games are going to be done in RetroArch. So when you start up a game, all you have to do is hit Select and X, and that's going to bring up the RetroArch menu. And as you see, he has a custom screen here for RetroArch. And it's going to be within here that you change your aspect ratio and things like that. And it might be a little bit overwhelming if you don't know how to use RetroArch, but once you get the hang of it, it actually makes a lot of sense and it's kind of intuitive. But there is a bit of a learning curve. Okay, let's talk about high-end game performance here. Let's start with Nintendo 64. Now, there are a lot of different Nintendo 64 emulator options when it comes to Retro Arena, and I found the best performance comes from the Mupen 64 Plus Retro Run core. And even though this one has really smooth gameplay, probably the smoothest out of all the three firmwares, unfortunately the resolution has been set to 320x240, so it looks kind of low res. But if you really want to make sure that you have smooth gameplay in your Nintendo 64 games, and you don't really care about having a high resolution display, this is going to be a good option for you. Now, unfortunately, PSP performance on Retro Arena seemed to be a little bit worse than it was on 351 Elect and on ArkOS, which we'll see here in a minute. And this is running with the same settings that I had on either of these firmwares. But because this firmware is still in a beta test phase right now, I expect this will probably get improved in the future as well. Now, you have quite a few options when it comes to Dreamcast emulation, and I found that the best performance comes from this Flycast 32 Rumble core from Retro Run 32. Now, that's a mouthful to say, but it's pretty easy to select within the emulator's options in the main menu. And like with the Nintendo 64, unfortunately this runs at 320x240 resolution, so it's a little bit lower of a resolution here. And that's going to make it hard to play any game that's very text intensive because it's going to be hard to read that text. Now Retro Arena has some unique functions I want to talk about within the tools and scripts options. So for example, you can pull up CPU information and it'll actually show you the temperature of your CPU, and that's pretty cool. You can also change the color of the LED on your device. So for example, if you want to have a green LED, you select that, or if you want a red LED, you can change it to red. And I think that red is going to come in handy if you want to try to play this in the dark. Now of these 3 custom firmwares, this is the only one that already has Moonlight already pre-built into it. But there are a couple caveats with that. The first one is that the controllers wouldn't work with the buttons themselves. I had to plug in a USB keyboard to actually navigate through the menus. And 2, I don't have an NVIDIA GPU, so I'm not actually able to test it myself. Even though I know there's a few workarounds and I tried to work a few of those, I couldn't get any of them to work. So if you already know how to use Moonlight and you want to try to use it on one of these devices, this is going to work for you. But for me, I couldn't get it to work in my testing. Now Retro Arena also has Amber ports already built into it. You can actually run Amber ports on 351LEC and ArkOS now, but you have to install it yourself. But just having it already pre-built into the operating system makes this really handy for me. And as you can see here, you can navigate through your games, you can select the game, and the open source games will allow you to install the game without having to add any extra files. Of course, the commercial ones mean you have to bring in the commercial files yourself. But again, these aren't all perfect. So for example, here I'm trying to play AM2R, and not only do the buttons not work, but it's only showing up on the bottom left screen here. So there's still some work to be done on some of these ports. But overall, there are a lot of things I like about Retro Arena. I love the fact that you can play just about any system under the sun, and if you hit up the developer and say, hey, can you get this system on here? He's probably going to work his butt off to get that working for you as well. So I love the community aspect of this firmware. I really love these new themes on it, and I'm excited to see where this one goes next. Now finally, let's talk about ArkOS. Now this is kind of bittersweet to me because the developer only plans on making one final release of ArkOS for the 351V, and then he's going to be done. He's calling it a one and done. And even though ArkOS runs really well on this device, I worry that it's going to become outdated over time. But let me show you what we have to work with here. Now, a lot like with Retro Arena, the only major change you can do to the games within the main menu is to change the emulators themselves. Most of the other work you're going to do is going to be through RetroArch. Now, just like with Retro Arena, you're going to have to run a script that's going to allow you to move all the contents from your first SD card over to your second SD card. And you can find that option within the options menu. One really neat feature is that the second SD card on ArkOS works with Retro Arena and vice versa, because they're very similar operating systems. Now, like I mentioned, if you want to get into the system settings, you have to hit select an X during a game, and then you're going to get into RetroArch here. And even though this interface looks different than it did on Retro Arena, it's the same exact RetroArch backend. So for example, you can go into settings, then video, and then scaling, and here you can change your integer scaling. So here I'm going to turn on integer scaling for Sega Genesis. And as you can see here, I have perfect pixels going for Aladdin, but the screen is just a little bit smaller now. These are the kind of settings you can change within RetroArch. Okay, let's talk about performance on the high-end systems. We're going to start with Nintendo 64 again. Now this one runs a standalone version of Mupen 64 Plus using the Rice graphics driver. And this one runs at a crisp 640 by 480 resolution, and it also has really nice performance. I would say overall, this one probably has the best mix of good graphics and good performance. And even though you can't see the frames per second on this particular emulator, the easiest way to tell whether or not performance is good is to play F0. And as you can see here, it's probably playing very close to 60 frames per second right here. It feels fast and smooth. Now moving over to PSP, these are the exact same settings that we used on Retro Arena and 351LEC. And performance here is a little bit worse than it is on 351LEC. You can see every once in a while it's dipping below the 30 frames per second, which means you're going to experience slowdown when you're playing the games. And a good judge for that is going to be Outrun 2006. You can see here with the same settings, it's playing well below 30 frames per second. And then if we go into the settings and change the max frames per second to 30 again, you can see it's just not quite as smooth as it was on 351LEC. It's still pretty good, but not as good as 351LEC was. Now Dreamcast is a different story here. This is one of my favorite systems to emulate on this device using ArkOS. And I made a standalone video about this a few weeks ago, but it's the exact same process here. It's running that Flycast 32 Rumble core on RetroRun 32. And so not only does it have fairly smooth gameplay, but it's also running at 640 by 480 resolution. So this is kind of the best of both worlds, smooth gameplay and crisp graphics. It's not going to play every Dreamcast game in the world, but the two that I just showcased are some of the harder ones to emulate, and they still ran pretty smooth. Now Amber ports works really well on ArkOS, which makes a lot of sense because this was initially developed for ArkOS. But you can see here AM2R is working just perfectly. The controls are fine and you're getting a full screen. And if you're not familiar with this game, it's basically a homebrew remake of the Game Boy game Metroid 2: The Return of Samus. And a lot of people know this because it's available on Android, but it's really cool that it's on this device too. And all the other ports that are available on Amber ports also work on ArkOS. So for example, here you can see I'm playing Undertale. And if you're curious on how to get this running, I did a video guide on this a couple weeks ago. So just go ahead and look back in my library and you'll find this. Okay, so in terms of performance, here's my summary here. The best Nintendo 64 performance that I found was on ArkOS because it had the high resolution 640 by 480, but then also relatively smooth gameplay. So if you really love Nintendo 64, right now ArkOS has the best performance. When it comes to PSP, the best performance was on 351 Elec. I recommend using a 1x1 resolution, an auto frame skip of 1, and then changing out your max frames per second down to 30 depending on the game itself. But you can see here with Virtual Tennis World Tour, I'm just using those default settings, frame skip of 1 and a resolution of 1x1, and it's running really nice and smooth. And finally, when it comes to Dreamcast performance, I also think that ArkOS is the best for this as well. I think the mixture of Flycast 32 Rumble Core within Retro Run 32 is the best performance you can find. And this has the nice crisp 640 by 480 resolution at a perfect 4:3 aspect ratio. Dreamcast on this system using this firmware is a delight. Okay, let's sum up these three firmwares in one table here. Now there's a couple caveats here. Number one, all of these judgments are based on my own perceptions here. They're completely arbitrary. So what I find to be good may not be the same for other people. None of this is supposed to be a definitive review on any of these systems. It's really just saying what I found when I was doing my own testing. And secondly, these evaluations are based only on the test builds that I tested over the past few days. And the way these custom firmwares work, a few days from now, they may be completely different. And they only get better. It's very rarely that any of these firmwares get worse. So take all this with a grain of salt. If you're watching this video and it's been a month or two since the video was released, I would check up on these firmwares because I bet you a lot of it has changed over time. Now getting into the weeds here, I basically gave 3 different ratings based on what I saw. There's a gold star, which basically means it's the best that you can find. And silver star means that it's really good, but it's just not quite a gold star. And then I gave out the bronze star or the orange star only when the performance was tangibly worse than the other two. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, it just means that the other two were a little bit better. Okay, so let's talk about the actual features that I focused on. Number one is accessibility, and that's the ease of use of the platform. What I mean by that is just how easy it is if you're a newcomer to jump into this system and figure out how to get your games running. I also lumped into here whether or not the firmware had online updates. So for example, 351 Elec and ArkOS both have the ability to update the system online over your Wi-Fi. Now Retro Arena is planning on doing something similar to that, but they're not quite there yet. And so that's why I gave it a silver star, because the user interface is not quite as easy as it is on 351 Elec, and even in some ways ArkOS, and then the online updates are just not there yet. Now for user experience, I gave 351 Elec the gold star here, because you can make a lot of your settings changes within Emulation Station without having to have a knowledge of RetroArch. Now if you know how to use RetroArch and you're comfortable with it, this really isn't going to matter to you because you'll be able to dive into it in any of these systems and jump into the RetroArch settings. Another thing that I looked at was the speed of the interface itself. And what I mean by that is how quickly you can turn off and on the system, and then how quickly the game loads when you select it. And in general, I found that ArkOS had the fastest loading of all the games, and 351 Elec had the worst. Another feature I wanted to look at was long-term support. Now in this one, I gave ArkOS the bronze star because they're planning on only doing one final build of this. So 6 months from now, there may be other features that are available in Retro Arena and 351 Elec that aren't going to be found in ArkOS because they're not making any updates to it after this final build. And even though Retro Arena and 351 Elec are planning on doing future updates, I gave 351 Elec the gold star here because there's an entire team behind the 351 Elec firmware, and Retro Arena is just one guy. And even though the developer of Retro Arena is very prolific, I expect that at some point he's going to move on to other systems and he's not going to have the time to keep the support going for Retro Arena on the 351V. Whereas I think the 351 Elec team are going to continue focusing on the 351V just like they are with the 351P and the 351M. So they get the gold star in that one. Now when it comes to the variety of systems and ports available to you, there's no question that Retro Arena has the best options available. ArkOS comes in a close second, but 351 Elec is definitely a distant third when it comes to this feature. But with the new addition of Amber ports on all 3 of these firmwares, you still get a lot of variety when it comes to ports, and then all of the major systems are fully supported. And I won't dive back into the details when it comes to performance for Nintendo 64, PSP, and Dreamcast, but like I said earlier, ArkOS gets the gold star for Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, and 351 Elec gets the gold star for PSP. Now, the major thing stopping me with Retro Arena was just that lower resolution for the Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. Unfortunately, I have a hard time playing something at a lower resolution after I've seen the higher resolution playing fine. So hopefully these will be updates and improvements that we'll see down the line. Alright everyone, this video is already way longer than I thought it would be, so I'm just going to cut it off here. I really hope this video was helpful for you in making a decision on what custom firmware you want to focus on, and I do want to do videos in the future specifically highlighting each of these firmwares. But for now, I hope you have all the tools you need to pick a custom firmware and start enjoying your RG351V. As always, thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming!